Chapter 7. The Deadliest Day. The Battle of Antietam. Sharpsburg, Maryland, September 17th, 1862. A quote from General William Tecumseh Sherman from the U.S. Army. I regard the death and mangling of a couple thousand men as a small affair, a kind of morning dash, and it may be well that we become so hardened. On the night of September 6th, 1862, the Army of Northern Virginia camped in Maryland. For the first time in the war, the South was on the offensive in enemy territory. The stakes were high. Having kicked the Yankees' top commanders up and down Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee knew that there would be no better time to take the fight to the north and let the Federals defend their own turf for a change. Not only would an attack on the north take some pressure off Virginia, but the great powers of Europe, intrigued by rebel victories and in dire need of southern cotton for their textiles factories, were starting to consider maybe getting involved in this little North American showdown. The southern states were Europe's primary source of cotton, and by September 1862, Confederate envoys in Britain, Russia, and France were making headway in persuading the great powers across the Atlantic to come to the South's aid, break the Union naval blockade on the southern states, and force an end to this war. With the British Prime Minister already sending Abraham Lincoln letters requesting a diplomatic solution, quote-unquote, with plans at separation, all the Southerners needed was one decisive victory on Northern soil to prove their worth and seal the deal. The 40,000 ragged, grizzled veteran soldiers of the Army of Northern Virginia had come to claim that victory, win a battle on enemy soil, lay waste to Northern railroad lines, demoralize the population, threaten D.C., and put an end to this silly war once and for all. Unfortunately for them, some absent-minded Confederate officer wrapped the entire battle plan for the invasion around 3 expensive cigars and then promptly lost the bundle in a field somewhere, where a group of elated Federal scouts stumbled across it, passed the orders along to their commanding officer, then smoked the cigars just to add insult to injury. Luckily for Robert E. Lee, their commanding officer was George B. McClellan, the commander who had bungled the attack on Richmond. McClellan had been fired for incompetence, but when his replacements proved to be even worse than he was, Lincoln had no choice but to call this guy back. Apparently, Lincoln had forgotten that McClellan was a man so overly cautious that it probably took him 4 hours and 80,000 soldiers before he'd commit to brushing his teeth in the morning. George McClellan had, in his hands, a piece of paper handwritten by Robert E. Lee that clearly explained exactly what the Confederate Army was going to do. Lee had 40,000 men, but he'd already split them into 2 groups. 3 divisions were scattered throughout western Maryland, while Stonewall Jackson's corps was off at Harper's Ferry trying to capture the Federal arsenal there. McClellan had 90,000 soldiers and knew exactly where the enemy forces were, what they were planning, and how they were laid out. McClellan had the military equivalent of a cheat, a code in a video game. It was the sort of thing that any army commander in military history would have gouged out an eye to receive. Naturally, he proceeded with extreme caution. On September 14th, 3 corps of McClellan's Army of the Potomac advanced toward South Mountain, looking to wedge themselves between Lee's detachments, split the Confederate forces in half, and potentially annihilate the entire Army of Northern Virginia. All that opposed him was the 5,000 men of General D.H. Hill's division. Hill, a cantankerous North Carolina college professor who loved nothing more than a good fight, positioned his Georgians and North Carolinians in a mountain pass called Turner's Gap, dug trenches, armed every man in his unit, from the officers down to the cooks and orderlies, and told his toxic force of soon-to-be-doomed soldiers to stand fast, fight to the death, and hold the line, because this is Sparta and all that. When he looked out at the sea of blue and uniformed men marching toward his position, Hill later remarked, "I do not remember ever to have experienced a feeling of greater loneliness." Amazingly, despite a couple of charges by a steel-toed Union army that outnumbered the Confederates 12-1, Daniel Harvey Hill's division held the pass for most of the day, but could not roll back the tide of McClellan's forces. The blue-coated men struggled up the rugged slopes of the mountain, scoring a key victory. Lee, knowing now that his plans had been discovered, scrambled to consolidate his forces. He pulled his men back to defensive positions around Sharpsburg, called back Hill's men from the Gap, and sent word to Jackson to hurry up with the capture of Harper's Ferry because things just got real around here. On the 15th of September, he had just 18,000 active troops to face 75,000 of McClellan's men. McClellan didn't attack. Lee continued bringing in men from Ferry to beef up his numbers. By the time the Army of the Potomac finally got its act together and attacked on the morning of September 17th, Lee had brought up most of Stonewall's corps and was now entrenched in defensive positions outside Sharpsburg. With 27,000 men, he was still in trouble, but McClellan had missed a golden opportunity to decimate the enemy troops before they could regroup. McClellan opened the festivities with a lights-out artillery bombardment on the Confederate left, mowing down the cornfield where Stonewall Jackson's corps were positioned. The Confederates, hoping to conceal themselves among the cornstalks, were ripped to shreds by artillery blasts that clear-cut the stalks, mulching everything in their path and leaving behind nothing but scorched earth. This jumbo barrage of Union artillery deforested the cornfield, forcing Stonewall's men to fall back toward a white church that belonged, ironically enough, to a German parish that was super into nonviolence and peace and not blowing up people with cannonballs. The barrage was followed by an all-out charge by Fighting Joe Hooker's corps. Fighting Joe, a hard-drinking Massachusetts boy, led his men barreling into Stonewall's shattered units, hoping to overwhelm them. Stonewall appealed for help. He got John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade. You know the expression, don't mess with Texas? That's good advice. John Bell Hood's knife-wielding Texans blood raged because they'd been called into combat just as they were getting ready to cook their first hot meal in 3 days, came blitzing out of the Confederate lines into Hooker's corps. Firing their muskets and fighting for everything they were worth, Hood's Texans charged out of the gun smoke, blunted the Union attack, pushed Hooker's men back, and broke their lines, but were then ferociously counterattacked by a second Union corps that came flying in out of nowhere and decimated Hood's troops with a couple of blasts of artillery. Hood ordered a retreat, falling back to Jackson's original position, but his men had done their job. Jackson had regrouped and was holding the line. When John Bell Hood reported to Stonewall that he'd completed his mission, Jackson asked, "Where is your division?" Hood's response, "Dead on the field." The second Union assault came around midday at the center of the Confederate position where D.H. Hill's already depleted troops were lying prone in an old sunken road. Hill ripped fire into the enemy with everything he had, knowing that he was the only thing holding the middle of the rebel line together. Hill's 2,500 troops, clinging to the narrow sunken road, turned back 4 separate valiant yet futile assaults by the Union Second Corps in under an hour, inflicting nearly 1 casualty for every rebel soldier manning the line. Just as it was looking like the Confederate center would hold out until the apocalypse, one enterprising brigade of New Yorkers managed to make their way to a ridge overlooking the sunken road, move around to the flank, and immediately open fire right down the line at the exposed Confederate position. The rebels, caught completely off guard, suddenly found themselves in a shooting gallery that would earn the sunken road the nickname Bloody Lane. One Confederate brigade commander, caught in the middle of the action, General John Brown Gordon, was wounded 4 times in the fighting, including a bullet that severed an artery in his leg and another that destroyed his arm, but he continued to rally his men until a 5th bullet hit him in the face, knocking him unconscious. He'd survive and become governor of Georgia after the war. That's incredible. The rebel center broke, clearing the way toward Sharpsburg. The now freaking out Confederate commanders, doing everything in their power to hold the line against the Union advance, D.H. Hill grabbed a musket off a dead soldier and personally led 200 men in a charge to retake a position that was being overrun by the Federals. General James Longstreet, second in command of the Confederate Army, only to Robert E. Lee, rushed to the front and manned a cannon. Times were as desperate as they could get. The Confederates had nothing in reserve. Their lines were crumbling, and every single semi-healthy soldier who had come across the Potomac River into Maryland was now currently deployed in the field. The rebels were pushed to the breaking point, clinging with their teeth and fingernails. McClellan still had a full reserve corps of infantry, over 10,000 men in position a mile from the field, waiting to get into the fray. Yet once again, the overly cautious Union commander refused to send them in to exploit the gap. Later in the afternoon, the attack began on the Confederate right flank, where Union General Ambrose E. Burnside, the general who'd been had so much trouble with Wheat's Tigers at the first Battle of Bull Run, attempted to force his 14,000-man corps over the narrow stone bridge that spanned Antietam Creek. Burnside's men were concealed in the woods on the Union side, but even though Antietam Creek was so shallow that a man could walk across it without getting his chin wet, for some reason Burnside was determined to cross his entire force over a bridge that was only wide enough for 8 soldiers to march side by side. All that opposed Burnside was 450 Georgians under the command of former U.S. Senator Robert Toombs. Toombs' small unit was hidden in the trees on a big hill overlooking the bridge, dug in with excellent cover on high ground, and all their guns and cannons were ranged in to pick off anyone who set foot on the bridge. But even so, this wasn't exactly an ideal situation. However, despite the entire rest of their division being called away to reinforce Confederate positions at Bloody Lane and the cornfield, Toombs's men stood their ground, battling for everything they were worth and pouring fire on the stone bridge that would come to be known as Burnside's Bridge. Amazingly, the Georgians held the bridge for several hours, scouring the Federals with bullets any time they set foot in the open. Burnside, a man whose fiancée said no, and ran away crying when the priest asked, "Do you take this man?" At his wedding, the woman, Lottie Moon, ended up working as a spy for the Confederacy. Finally had enough of seeing his people get shot to shreds, so he assembled 2 of his harshest fighting units, the 51st Pennsylvania Infantry and the 51st New York Infantry, and told them he was going to double their whiskey rations if they could take that bridge, and I mean right stinkin' now, gentlemen. The 2 units fixed bayonets, ran for it, braved a hostile spray of bullets, shrapnel, and artillery, forced their way across the bridge despite heavy casualties, lowered their bayonet-equipped rifles, and charged up the hill at the Georgians, who had terrorized their brethren. The survivors of Toombs' command split out of there. The other half lay dead. For some ungodly reason, with the entire Confederate flank destroyed and an undefended Sharpsburg sitting there for the taking, General Ambrose E. Burnside ordered the 51st New York and Pennsylvania not to pursue. He then spent the next 2 hours crossing the rest of his men over that same stupid bridge and forming them up on the other side. Right around the time he was ready to move, Burnside's men saw a huge force of men charging toward them in blue uniforms, flying American flags. Burnside was like, "What the heck is going on?" Then watched in horror as this new unit lowered their rifles and opened fire at point-blank range, cutting a gaping hole into Burnside's ranks. It was Confederate General Ambrose Powell Hill's division of battle-hardened rebels, fresh off a 17-mile march from Harper's Ferry, decked out in uniforms and equipment they'd just looted from the Federal arsenal. Burnside's inexperienced troops fell back to the bridge and failed to press the attack. The fighting had been gruesome, and Lee had almost broken 3 times under the relentless Federal assault. But in the end, the decimated army of Northern Virginia somehow held the line. The next day, both forces were stuck in a staring contest. McClellan naturally didn't want to attack. Lee did, but he knew he didn't have the manpower. So Lee waited. Lee waited until nightfall, then slipped his army of Northern Virginia back across the river and out of Maryland. McClellan refused to give chase to Lee's decimated army. This was the last straw, as far as President Lincoln was concerned. The commander-in-chief stripped McClellan of his command for the second time and promoted Ambrose Burnside, of all people, to lead the Army of the Potomac instead. McClellan responded by returning home and preparing to run against Abraham Lincoln in the presidential election of 1864 under a platform of, quote-unquote, hey, let's stop fighting this war because it's stupid. The Battle of Antietam was the single bloodiest day not only of the Civil War, but in all of American military history. The horrifying carnage left 23,000 casualties, a number that is more than the Americans who died in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War combined. It's over 9 times the number of Americans killed at D-Day. Technically, the battle is considered a draw, but it was a strategic Union victory. The Union failed to destroy Lee, and Lee failed to win a history-altering victory on Union territory, but the consequences of Antietam were even more wide-ranging than that. It was the deciding factor in Europe's refusal to throw their support behind the Southern cause. If the South was going to win the war, it was going to have to do it without any outside help. Photographic memory. One of the world's first photojournalists, New Yorker Matthew Brady, used the relatively new technology of the photograph to take some of the most intense pictures of the Civil War. Following the armies around on the front lines and using a covered wagon as a makeshift darkroom while bombs exploded around them, Brady and his team of photographers took over 3,500 pictures of the conflict, documenting the Civil War in a way that no other war to date had ever been recorded. These photos not only provided families lasting memories of their sons, brothers, and husbands, but also enabled newspapers and magazines to bring the horrors of the war into the living room of every person in the country. The angel of the battlefield. A Massachusetts schoolteacher with no medical training, Clara Barton, was quote-unquote the angel of the battlefield, volunteered to work as a nurse at dozens of engagements. At Antietam, she was so close to the fighting that one of the men she was assisting was killed as she was working on him, the bullet passing through the sleeve of her dress and hitting him in the heart. Barton would follow the Army of the Potomac with wagon loads of medical supplies, aiding wounded men wherever she came across them. She would end up founding the American Red Cross after the war, serving as its president from 1882 to 1904, and dedicating her life to identifying anonymous soldiers killed in action. So that's where the American Red Cross started, from Clara Barton, a volunteer. West Point. One important thing to take into account when reading daring tales of heroic generals battling one another is that most of these men knew each other, and many of them had gone to college together. For instance, while A.P. Hill was an upperclassman at West Point, he tried to steal the fiancée of his roommate, George McClellan. McClellan responded by telling his fiancée a bunch of horrible lies about Hill and marrying Mary Ellen McClellan in 1854. This is a photograph of Confederate General A.P. Hill. Our last image for this chapter is the Battle of Antietam. We see here the troops. The Union had 87,000 soldiers. The Confederates had 45,000. Casualties: 12,401 men, soldiers, people died in that war for the Union side, and the Confederates lost 10,316. The result was a Union victory. That's the end of Chapter 7. I hope you're having a very nice day.